Michael Gurion is a marriage and family counselor in private practice and a New York Times bestselling author. He's published 32 books in over 23 different languages. As a social philosopher, he has pioneered efforts to bring neurobiology and brain research into homes, schools, corporations, and public policy. The Gurion Institute, which he co-founded, conducts research internationally, launches pilot programs, and trains professionals. Michael has spoken for the United Nations on violence against women, provided information on boys' and girls' educational needs to the White House, and briefed members of Congress on the boy crisis in America. His most recent book, published in 2017, is titled Saving Our Sons, A New Path for Raising Healthy and Resilient Boys. Michael's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A after that. Join me now in welcoming Michael Gurion to the podium.
Thank you so much for having me. The whole institute, administration, everybody. It's great. I live in Spokane, so it was just a gorgeous drive down. If you haven't driven it in a while, it is really gorgeous. It's very cold, but just absolutely gorgeous. And an honor to be here. So there's some ironies in me. I have actually written a number of books on girls as well, though that's not our subject today. But the irony is that I have no sons. It's always ironic for the books on boys. I have two daughters, so they're similar ages. I'm 28, 25. You said yours are, how old are your sons?
They don't put me on the spot right now.
Oh, okay. But
27 and 30.
27 and 30, yeah, very similar ages, kind of millennials, Gen. I'm always confused by, they're, and two incredibly empowered young women who are running the world, who are preparing to run the world, and all the way even through their upbringing and through their, just all the way through, they were raised in Spokane. They would always be watching this stuff because they knew their father was involved in boys and girls, and then a lot in boys and men, etc. And they would be watching it, and they would come home from school saying, "Boy, I'm sure glad I'm a girl. I am sure glad I'm a girl." And they were constantly trying to get friends, boyfriends, friends, male friends, help them with their homework, try to get it so they could at least get C's, and they were watching it. And we, of course, have been watching it from a research standpoint for decades. So I started this research 40 years ago. I started speaking, etc., 30 years ago, and the Gurion Institute formed 20 years ago. And for anyone who's interested, because I only have a little amount of time, so you're going to want to follow up, go to gurioninstitute.com, just put in my last name, gurioninstitute.com, and you'll see schools and all sorts of places that are using this research, and that, for instance, when this stuff is taught to schools, the test scores for both boys and girls go up. So there's no either or, there's nothing zero-sum. Even for me as a feminist, I've never been a zero-sum feminist. I always knew if we empowered both, we were going to help both. But unfortunately, so I'm going to actually hit you with some myths today. So if I piss anyone off, you just put it on a shelf, I beg you, and during Q&A, feel free to challenge me. And I like a good argument, However, that said, it's been very tough for what I call the big three. I'll pull out Saving Our Sons here. The big three, which is academics, government, and media. It's very hard to really grapple with the fact that the situation for males and females now in 2019 is not the situation that it was 50 years ago. But there's a real, what we call evolutionary drag in the social science around this. So the way that I've dealt with it is to avoid anecdotal social science and to spend my time in neuroscience and applied neuroscience. So I'll actually be showing you scans of male and female brains, and you'll see how different they are. Okay, I'm going to hit you with 4 myths that ground our difficulty forming appropriate public policy for boys and men, and then of course I'll be draping policy in there. A little joke, because when talking about these things one must have humor. So just out, a new book for men on how to understand women. This is my metaphor for our culture the last 50 years. And of course, having daughters and being an advocate for girls, I'm really glad that we have this huge book that we developed over the last 50 years. It's awesome. However, the question is, how large and detailed, and I have to remember to stand here because they're, right? It's right here? So I apologize if I go over. How large and detailed is our theoretical, academic, educational, psychological manual on how to understand boys and men? And I'm going to argue it's much smaller because we have not spent Our concept has been males have privilege, especially white males have privilege, and males have it all, and women don't have it, and girls don't have it, and we've got to get girls and women to have it, and we don't really need to pay attention to boys and men. That's really a summary. So we haven't really spent time on it. And so my work is nature-based. I start with nature, then move to nurture and culture. And that's the reason I've stopped doing a lot of culture study, which is very valuable. But in terms of male-female, culture does not pay attention. Culture study generally dislikes nature. It wants to just deal in paradigms like paradigms of masculinity. And I like that, but I want to figure out what's nature. What's actually going on in boys and men, so that we can apply ourselves to it and figure out what to do to help them. So you'll see down here, just to full disclosure, things like gender roles and gender norms, which are really huge, I know, in academics, in the big three, academics, government, and the media. I don't spend a lot of time with them anymore. I did 30 years ago. But now I'm spending more time trying to get at the roots of the issues that we face. So, full disclosure, just to start out. So if you're saving up questions, here we go. First myth. This was, I think, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, obviously very true, that men had more privilege than women and girls. Is it a myth now? It's a myth now. We both have suffering, and we both have privilege. And I'll give you some examples. What are the mental and physical health outcomes right now and compare the demographic groups, white males and white females? Who's doing better in not just the US, but the whole Western world? White males or white females? White females, you're right. White females are doing better when you look at the aggregates than white males. And this is true not just in the US, but it's true throughout all 72 industrialized countries. The WHO came out with that in 2015, and I will pull this out because you mentioned this book, and I was going to read stats from it, but I won't. This book, the first chapter, Saving Our Sons, for anyone who wants to look at it, lays out all of the stats, including the WHO. So the WHO came out with this in 2015 and said, okay, the old paradigm is not correct. We have to realize that even white males are doing worse than white females, and we have to adjust public policy worldwide. So why? Why is it difficult? Because, of course, there's about 50,000 or however many there are white males who are at the very top, right, which creates optics. And those guys, some of them, a lot of them are running our country right now. So it's very hard to say these guys don't have privilege. But what you have to do is go under those guys. And it's under those guys that the judge is dealing, right? Your friend the judge is dealing with all the other levels. Not these 50,000 or so, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, etc., Donald Trump, etc., but everyone else. And when you look at all of those stats, that's where you see the issues emerge. And that's even true in college campuses. What's the national average for males and females in a college campus? You know?
It's more women.
It's more women. It's 60% women, 40% men. And I don't know your data here. Someone will have it. I see no reason you wouldn't also be majority female, because most colleges are majority female. But what about law school? Majority female. What about med school? Majority female. And all of these things are great for females, so I'm not a zero-sum person. I think it's awesome. But we gotta go deeper and look at what's really going on. And what we find is, what about D's and F's? D's and F's in any school in the country. Average D's and F's. Who gets 70% of the D's and F's? A boy or a girl? Boys. Who in all 50 states test scores are behind? Boys. Right? The optics are, wait a minute, girls in school are struggling. It's boys who are doing well. It's just, they're myths. All 50 states, the boys are behind. Now, why? The most public detail that we hear a lot about, and it's a very worthy one, we have to keep talking about it, is girls in STEM. And I wrote a whole book on this, so obviously very into trying to solve some of these STEM gaps. How big is the STEM gap, the science and math gap, in test scores? Girls are behind boys. Do you know how big it is nationwide? Okay, it's around 3 points. How big is the male literacy gap? It's 10 points. It's more than 3 times larger. So we have to find a way to empower and help females, which, by the way, is not going to stop. That's not going anywhere. That's with us forever, thankfully. But we also have to realize that it's not 50 years ago. That a lot of the kids suffering in your neighborhood and a lot of the adults suffering in your world, if you step back and look at it, you'll see a lot of them are boys and a lot of them are men. Of course, there's also women who are depressed. There's girls who have anorexia and bulimia. It's not zero sum. It's all over. But this myth we're going to have to get rid of. And when I hear this, when I hear people say, yeah, but white males have all the privilege, or you're a white male, or any of that, I just stop talking to them. I just go, that's too racist and sexist for me. You wouldn't allow anyone to say that about a black male. You wouldn't allow anyone to say that about a black female, etc. It's too racist and sexist. We need a new language. It's too polarizing. We certainly want to study white males who have privilege, and we will keep doing that. There's a whole machine studying that, so there's no problem with that. But to lead with that and to say we really care and we have empathy for all human beings, to lead with that is, I think, no longer effective and needs to go in a category. And then people will say, well, no, you can't be racist and sexist against a dominant class. And to me, that's part of the problem. Because what you've done is assumed that all white males are a dominant class. And if you study, again, the demographics and break down the numbers, that's a really hard thing to pull off if you're using science. Easy thing to pull off with opinion. Very hard to pull off with science and data. Okay, so what we have to deal with now, without negatively impacting females, what we have to deal with now is that our social systems, many of them are set up way better for females than males. The divorce child custody system. If you study that system, set up way better for females than males. And you just break them down. The school system, way better. And I'll show you scans about that here in a moment. And in public policy, like as you were saying, I've been in front of the UN, I've been in front of Congress. When I try to talk to folks about this, it's very hard for them to see that because they've been told, but no, females are suffering, guys are doing well. Very hard for them to see it. So it's very hard for them to see systems, that systems are actually set up to degrade males and to upgrade females, because that's a real switch from 50 years ago. 100 years ago, or only a little over 100 years ago, women even got the vote, right? So there's a long history of suppression of females, but now systems have shifted. And I am not one of those people who blames feminism. I'm a feminist. I voted for Democratic presidents ever since I started voting, so I'm clearly not some crazy arch conservative person that I get accused of being, which I also think is labeling me. But I'm clearly not that. I come from a feminist tradition and still consider myself a very strong feminist. And for me, I don't see us making gains for women. I think our gains are freezing for girls and women, specifically because of the fact that so many males are in so much distress. And it's very hard for us to create a society that's going to ultimately empower girls and women much more if we don't figure out what we're going to do with, like what you've called in your posters, the boy problem. So therefore, I think this is a big challenge for us, because we can't create public policy until we actually admit this, that systems are not set up well for males. And one of the ways you can just do it on your college campus and have fun with it is and it's actually scary, is get a list, try to put together a list of who commits the microaggressions on your college campus. Right? Microaggressions are big all over. And what you'll find is that 95% of the microaggressions are committed by males, which should tell us something. That even that system we may need to rethink. Because if you have mainly one population committing the aggressions that the population doesn't like, there might be something going on with the system that's set up that way. Because it really doesn't make sense that we would set up a system of microaggressions that would be fair, in which there are 5 women who commit a microaggression, but 95 males. So it's something you can do. You can be a citizen science and just check it out. And I don't know what access you all have to that data, but I think you'll find that. Okay. So these are just some of the stats that folks often don't know. 2/3 of the D's and F's, high school dropouts, only 40% of undergraduates. Most learning difficulties, male. Most severe mental illness, male. That includes female depression statistics. Most discipline problems, male. And they're far more, and Saving Our Sons has them all if anyone wants to use that. Okay, so the second myth, one of the things that I found in my 40 years here doing this, is that it's very hard, I believe it's very hard to fully advocate for girls and women also, if we deny the fact that there's a male and a female brain. But it's especially hard to advocate for boys and men. Because if you don't look at brain research and you don't look at male-female brain difference, then ultimately one would just say, well, every system just should shift toward female brain. And we are seeing that quite a bit without our realizing it. Like we work a lot in schools, and one of the first things that school teachers say, most of whom are female, is they'll say, you got to help us with the boys, because I think differently than they do. And I know I'm over-punishing them, and I know I'm not understanding how their minds are operating, but this is how the system's set up. It's set up to sit still and learn, and to please the teacher, and to hand in homework, and that's how it's set up. And I didn't get any training in any of this when I got my MED or when I got my bachelor's in education. Universities don't train, unfortunately, schools of ed don't train the teachers in this. It needs to be a one-semester course, but there are a lot of political reasons for which it is not. And like whenever I've gone to Harvard to speak, always an argument about this, about two political camps. One political camp saying, no, there's no male-female difference, because if there is, then males are going to be superior, females are going to be inferior, which is not the case. Then there's another political camp that says, well, it's only about difference. It's only about male-female brain difference, and they're at war. And what's really true is that male-female brain difference is wired into X and Y chromosomes, so it's an absolute across cultures. But as we all know, especially from the last few years, there's a big spectrum of what is male and female, right? There's 7.5-ish billion people on Earth, so we've got about 3.75 billion-ish people who are female brain, but on a spectrum, and males, right? A lot of ways to be male, a lot of ways to be female. But I'm showing you this to show you that some of the brain differences that come in on X and Y are really robust and explain a lot. And these are all parts of the brain that operate differently. And I'll pull out a couple. Anterior cingulate cortex. Females have up to 4 times more activity in that cortex. That is the cortex for focus and attention. So right away your minds are probably going. You're thinking, focus and attention. Which sex has the most attention and focus problems? Boys, right? They dominate ADD and ADHD. Now females can be underdiagnosed. Females don't get ADD as severely, and we miss it in females, so that actually can happen. But at the same time, most ADD, ADHD kids are male. And one of the reasons is this is an XY brain difference. Comes in on XY. And I keep saying XY because the fascinating and fun thing about studying nature, human nature, and starting with the brain and then moving to nurture, then culture, is that you're looking at robust differences that massive sample sizes show, like sample sizes in the millions, and they appear in all cultures. Why do they appear in all cultures? Because of the X and the Y. Because females are XX, males are XY. And I am going to speak in a moment about transgender, so don't worry, I'm going to speak about that. It actually does not deny male and female brain. But transgender is a very tiny population. And most people, and even transgender, are XY. And I'll explain why it happens. So we've got a spectrum of what is male and female, but at the same time, male brain and female brain are robust across cultures because of XY. So another one, just the frontal lobe. So the female brain moves more of its electrical processing up to the frontal lobe. Male brain moves more of its processing down into the body. So if you think about frontal lobe is the executive decision-making part of the brain, and it's also the part of the brain that does words. And females do words on both sides of the brain. Males do words on the left. So that's another profound brain difference. When we look at that, why are males 10 points behind females in in literacy, which is reading, writing. Why? One of the nature-based reasons is we start out with less of our brain is being used for words. We connect less in our brain word centers to midbrain. Midbrain is where senses happen, where memory is, where emotions are, right? Female brain moves this stuff up to word centers. Males have a strong emotion. One of the strongest emotions that we track in males is what emotion?
Anger.
Anger, right. And what happens is the same place swells up in the male and the female brain, but the right side of it, the amygdala, swells up. The right side for males, which is the anger side. The left side, the worry side, swells up for females. And more female moves up here, so she's more likely, right, to have more complex emotive response initially. Males will get angry and they move it through the body. And you've seen this, because what are males very likely to do? Right? They're like, something in the body. Neither of these, by the way, is inferior or superior. They're different. We got to understand them. So those are just a few, and I know we're going to move fast. So 4 elements of sex and gender. So when you hear people say, well, wait, it's non-binary, there's no such thing as sex in the brain, there's no male-female because it's non-binary, and all of that. When you hear that in pop culture, and you also do hear it at universities, let's be really clear about what's going on, because it's very, very important. X and Y controls physiologic. So we all know about that. Reproductive organs, muscle mass ratios, iron in the blood, calcium, all of those. X and Y has chromosome markers for male and female there. And I think no one has trouble with that. We can all see each other, we're different. But what we didn't know until about 50 years ago is that neurological sex on the brain is also controlled by XY on the spectrum. So when you hear people say we're not binary, if you want to help boys and men, you got to push back on them and say, no, you're missing it. The male and female brain are binary. There is male brain and female brain, but they're on a spectrum. The X and the Y, however, create binary brains. They create males who do language on the left and females who do language on both sides. Males who use up to 7 times more gray matter activity, which localizes brain responses, and females up to 10 times more white matter activity, which creates varied responses because she's processing throughout the brain really fast and coming up with 5 or 7 options, whereas guys will tend to focus. These all come in on X and Y. So there is a binary baseline that in no way harms vulnerable populations, so LGBTQ. None of them are harmed by this. In fact, lesbian, gay, bisexual populations, I think we finally were able to advocate for them because we were able to bring science in. And we were able to say, this is not a choice, this comes in on this nucleus. So 5 to 10% of humans and mammals are what we call LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual. In other words, they're same-sex orientation, 5 to 10%. And that's among the mammals as well. So about 40 years ago, this was discovered, the sexually dimorphic nucleus in the anterior hypothalamus, by autopsy. They would autopsy straight and gay people, and they would see it and go, oh, okay, that's interesting. There's clearly this difference. And that has continued. So my argument is, if we use more science, we're going to advocate for more vulnerable populations because we're going to being able to show what's going on in the brain. Similarly with what we call transgender now is actually transsexual. We just don't use the word. Because what's happened is you have an extreme bridge, this term I developed, bridge brain, which is for people who are the 1 in 5 who will think, they're males, but I think more female, or I'm female, I think more male, but I'm not trans. I think more like the other. And we have about 1 in 5 who report this. Anyone can think it at any moment, but you have to be longitudinal and say, okay, over a 2-month period, over a 3-month period, what's going on up here? And about 1 in 5, and it would fit what we think of as people saying I'm non-binary gender, etc., which is about 1 in 5 in the U.S. right now. But that's different than transsexual. Transsexual is you scan. If any of you know someone who's trans, you can get their brain scanned, and you will see that their brains are operating opposite of the reproductive organs. So we now know of 28 brain centers. The last study I saw was 28 brain centers that are operating across the sexual spectrum. So in other words, a female to male who has always known, and we got to wait till puberty. We got to wait. In terms of public policy, by the way, a lot of people are saying at 5, I know I'm trans. They can't. That's very dangerous. You have to wait through puberty, get to at least 14 or 15, if you're really being safe. Because by then you can see what is really going on. That person by 15 probably has known for 13 years when they got cognizant. They've probably known, I just don't think the way my organs think. I am something else. I'm a female body, but I got to go to male because my brain must think male. Well, now we can scan and we can say, yeah, you're right. Similarly, if you're male to female, my body is male, penis, testicles, but my brain, I don't fit this body, and I've known this for 10 years. So that's actually transsexual, but we call it transgender. So that's 1, 2, 3, and then gender fluidity, gender non-binary, which is very popular to talk about now, is folks saying, which I think is neat. We did it back in my day. I'm 60, so back when I was many of you, we did it with androgyny. I was going to develop my feminine side, which is great. I'm glad I did it. And that was our word for it. Now the word is gender fluidity or gender non-binary. It's a really good thing to do, to expand the self and go, what am I? I mean, really, do I have to be this male or this female? Can't I expand? Of course. And that's a really great thing. But it doesn't, that's culture stuff. That's masculinity, femininity, whatever you want to say about that. That's not this. Your brain is still going to do language, either on the left or on both sides of the brain. And those 100 brain differences that we can track will exist. And now I'll show you some scans. So here are scans from UPenn. Blue is male. I'm going to go fast. Blue is male. Brown is female. What this scan is trying to show is doing the same task. The female brain crosstalks. Moves a whole bunch of blood, electricity, blood flow, glucose metabolism, moves it to here, frontal lobe, corpus callosum, right in here. Thinking, executive decision making, language, connecting words to feelings, etc. Same task, what the male does is male moves it back to front. You'll notice there is not a thick bundle of activity that goes back and forth on the blue. Can everyone see that? Not a lot of activity, but on the brown, the female, you see that activity. So she's cross-talking between hemispheres, and he's moving it front to back. And that's really common. It's called lateralization of brain activity, and males tend to lateralize their brain activity. And one fun way to think about it is try it all out. I'm really into citizen science. I think you should all become scientists. Study these books, study everything, and then go out and apply it and see what happens. So one thing, if any of you are in a relationship, is track conflicts you get in, and for this you're going to need cross, you're going to need hetero. Track conflicts you get in over a period of 1 month, and notice the number of words that females use when they're in the conflict, arguing, talking, etc., the amount of sensorial detail they use, the amount of memory detail they use, compare it to the male. One that's quick and easy is memory. She will be able to download 5 to 10 incidents that track along the string of this, right? Because she's going to connect words to hippocampus, words to feelings fast. He is going to not be able to do that as well, and he's going to tend to move quicker toward problem solving because he's moving it front to back. And he does language on the left. So one of the primary reasons you will find males try to problem solve too quick, we always have to train them. Wait a minute, don't problem solve. We need 5 minutes of listening. Gotta listen. But they're then going to tend to problem solve. And one reason is, and the primary brain reason is, they move it front to back. So the problem comes in left, their word centers are left, they're moving it front to back on the left side and creating words on the left side. To solve the problem. So, if you did this, you wouldn't feel this way, right? Which drive women crazy. But that's just an example of a brain difference. And I'm going to show you scans, by the way, that are from all races and that are from 3 different continents, and they all show the same. So here's the National Institute of Mental Health that had decided, of course, they have access to tens of thousands of MRIs. So they decided to put them together, and they got all races, all groups covered. And this goes back to that XY thing. And they kind of show it. Now, by the time they get to, those of you who are here at this school, you're more in this age group. By the time you get to this age group, it's about half and half in terms of operating differently. But if you go back to 10 years old, most of the brain is operating differently between a 10-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. 16, still most of the brain operating differently. By 20, and this is what remains robust through life, it's about half and half. And we think the reason nature did this, it's not, you're going to say, well, it's culture, but whenever you hear someone say that, challenge them, because stuff that comes on an X and Y, the culture doesn't matter to it. It still manifests no matter what culture it's in. And this is an example. By the time people reach 20, what is it that nature wants them to do? They won't all do it, but what is it by the time you're 20, nature is saying, well, if you want immortality, you ought to do what? Yeah, you ought to reproduce. And that means you're probably going to need to find, and of course, given that 90-95% are hetero, so that's how nature is set up, except for this wonderful, interesting thing, the 5 to 10% who are not, which there are many theories of why that's carried in the genes. But for basically the evolutionary trend of nature, it's been toward you got a couple and you got to be able to stay together as long as possible to raise your kids. Again, it doesn't always work, and it shouldn't always work, but that's sort of how it's set up. So that would explain the scans and the fact that all races, all cultures, you get the same result. I'll give you one more. These are brain scans at rest. This is one of the biggest policy issues that are faced by every educational institution, including colleges. Why are colleges losing so many males? Well, there are a lot of reasons. And then why are schools losing so many males? The loss of males in college starts all the way back in kindergarten. All the way back. And one of the things that I'm begging every department of ed to start teaching is this one semester course in this. Because when the teachers see this, their eyes widen. This is the male brain, that's the female brain, and the brain is in what we call the rest state. And the rest state is not sleep, but it's a state of mind where you can see each other doing it. And generally, since the female brain is highly active in a rest state, it's mainly males you see. And what do males tend to do in a classroom if their brain enters the rest state? What would be another word for the rest state in a classroom? It starts with a B. What?
Space out.
Boredom. Space out is a good one. Space out, boredom. So we call it a boredom state, but it's the same thing. They're sitting in a chair between around 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the person. There are nerves here that start telling the brain, it's okay, you can go to rest. We're not moving, so just hit the rest state. So they start doing this, and especially if they're not stimulated. And it goes to a rest state, and look how empty the brain is when it hits the boredom state. And look at the female brain. This is a bored female right here. She has come to this lecture and she's like, I hate this guy, he's so boring. But her verbal centers, memory centers, emotive centers, everything's still active. So she's absolutely bored, but she's taking the notes, right? And then who's she going to give those notes to? Probably going to be the guy. Because he was not challenged, he was not, and his brain needs it. And we think one of the reasons is because million years of human history, boys were moving around more, and girls were more sedentary. And you look at how this stuff gets in the genes. Her brain stays active when sedentary, but his brain tends to need more movement. And we call that cerebellum dependence. At the base of the brain is the cerebellum, and it's the doing center of the brain. And if that is activated in males, they learn better, they do better on tests, etc. If not, with a 1 in 5 exception rate, they're less likely to do as well. So it's another piece of it. I'll do one last brain thing, and then I got to move on to the other two myths. So testosterone, which people make fun of, testosterone's huge. It's the reason, it's what the chromosome markers kick in, so that babies, by the time they're 6 months in utero, differentiate male and female. By the time they're 6 months in utero. And this is the primary reason, because the Y chromosome triggers testosterone flow in all kids, but males get up to 20 times more. And that happens when the testes drop in utero and they're flooded with testosterone and it rewires the brain. So it starts early. But one thing that has to do with policy is we don't understand it very well. And so we tend to group aggression and violence. And you'll often hear people say that was aggressive, or and microaggressions are a great example of it. You know, you made that joke about this person. That was aggressive, and I don't like it. Well, aggression is actually a good thing. We all need aggression. It's violence that's bad. Aggression is natural. Every human being, male, female, trans, every human being, at some level knows you got to be aggressive in order to succeed. And you just channel it into the right times, the right places. Aggression is not a bad thing, it is a good thing. Violence is destructive. So aggression is me challenging you, and then you challenging me back. That builds resilience, it builds maturation, it's good. Violence is me trying to destroy you, or you trying to destroy me, or us trying to destroy core self, which is our psych term for self, being. That's violence. If we don't know about differences in chemicals, we won't realize that a lot of the stuff we're punishing guys for is actually resilience building. That jumping on each other and wrestling builds resilience. Right into the brain builds resilience. And we all want resilience, right? But when we talk about it, we think, well, aggression, that's too aggressive. It's violence, and we don't make the distinction. But here in this college, make the distinction between aggression and violence, because that's how you're going to save a lot of males, and by the way, a lot of females. I'm a dad of 2 daughters, and we used to do crazy aggressive things that drove my wife Gail crazy, like throwing them up in the air and then throwing them between my legs and then flipping them over and all this stuff. And it builds resilience, and the research on it is really deep. If you look at father-mother research, paternal nurturance, maternal nurturance, and you'll see how much resilience this paternal nurturance builds, which is aggression-oriented, but not violent. Okay, so I can only do that quick, but there's a whole lot there. All right, third myth that we have got to get rid of if we're going to affect good public policy is we got to get rid of this 100% emphasis, and it's very often in the big 3, academics, government, and media, this big emphasis on masculinity, traditional masculinity, and toxic masculinity. And of course, it's in the news now all over. If you're probably too busy, but if you get onto social media and you type in Gillette commercial, big argument about that, right? And then if you type in APA guidelines, which is American Psychological Association, APA guidelines, huge argument about those, which are for all of us psych people, but which don't actually talk about males. They only talk about toxic masculinity, traditional masculinity, that it's destructive, etc. So a lot of us who are actually in the field have been arguing that that's too thin. So you can hit social media and you'll see an argument about this, and you may have had fun arguments, and hopefully you will, because masculinity, no problem to expand what masculinity is. It's a culture construct, and it's no problem to say, yeah, I want to develop my feminine side. I want masculinity to include that, or whatever language you use is great. But our social problems do not exist because of masculinity. And that is the myth that will take more than this half hour for people to get through, because it's a huge big 3 myth. And what I find it is incredibly simplistic. I think what we did over the last 30 to 40 years is we said, we got to find something wrong with boys and men that fits our paradigm. And our paradigm is patriarchy, oppressed women and girls. I think we would all agree with that. I certainly would. I mean, I'm really glad that I and my daughters did not live 200, 300 years ago. So, I think, let's say we'll all agree with that. You might not, but just for this moment, say yes. And since we buy into that theory, which is our strong early feminist theory that all of us, when we were in your ages, bought into, which I think is right, the problem is, well, the patriarchy is dissolving, so we got to find a way, and women's equality has to a great extent been reached, so we have to find a way, though, to keep this thing moving. So what we're going to say is that it's not just patriarchy, but it's masculinity. And it's traditional masculinity, which is be stoic, be aggressive. We're going to say that that's psychologically harmful. Well, a number of us who are research-based have come out against that, because actually there isn't data to back that up. Being stoic is not harmful. In fact, being stoic is very helpful. Stoic, right, meaning I'm not going to show my emotions right now. It's actually a crucial thing, and we're trying to teach women and girls to be more stoic. Because from a research viewpoint, what we're seeing is incredible anxiety and rumination in women and girls, coming up at puberty, early adolescence, all the way through high school, moving into adulthood. We're getting increased anxiety rates in females, and one of the reasons when we scan female brains, we see that they're creating rumination loops between that cingulate cortex, which is why I mentioned it, and the amygdala in the midbrain. And they're worrying for 2, 3, 4 days about something. And over a period of years, that rewires them toward more depression and more anxiety. So it is untrue that stoicism is unhealthy. It is untrue that aggression is unhealthy. In fact, we want girls to be more aggressive, not violent, but more aggressive. So this is something that everyone has to sort through, and you have to do it in your own classes because we don't have the time today. But that's myth number 3. We are not going to get social programs and policy to work to help guys if all of those policies say, basically, what our policy has to be is remove masculinity. That's what's bad. We got to remove it. And that's going to be our policy. It won't work, number 1, because most boys and parents and men and even women think it's nuts. It only works in the bubble. But out in the world, it doesn't really work because most people are common sense, and they go, "Well, wait a minute. My boy's okay. He's kind of bounces around, and he at 15 he's more stoic, let's say, than my daughter maybe. But that seems to work. What's wrong with that? Right? When you get outside the bubble, it doesn't really work. And then the other reason it doesn't work is that it creates incredible backlash, and we are right now living in the backlash politically. Because we so overplayed the masculinity is bad, so overplayed it, that we're getting politically and ideologically a massive pushback. And that massive pushback is just increasing the polarization on these issues. And I think the stand we're taking, too thin. Got to go deeper, it's too thin. It can't fully work, even though it feels great. And especially if you're a feminist, it feels great. And so I get it, because I'm a feminist. But it's not going to work. It's too thin. We have to expand beyond it, beyond just culture, and move into nurture and nature. And that's a challenge. Okay, and one of the best ways we can fight it is we can think about what causes violence. And, you know, public policy, especially around males, a lot of public policy ultimately becomes about violence. Because that is the thing that scares us the most about males, is violence. I'm gonna do a few things, but I'm gonna challenge you because a new study just came out from the CDC. Who is more likely to be a victim of domestic violence, a woman or a man? Some say woman, some say men. Okay, so it's nuanced. In terms of incidence, women are more likely to strike men. So in terms of the aggregate number, men are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than women. However, what's the strike that generally happens? What is it she generally does? Right, slaps him really hard, right? And her expectation is, if I slap him really hard, he's not going to slap me back, or hit me back. And one of the reasons is the code of masculinity, right? The masculine code is you never harm a female. That's a masculine code that all of us boys were raised with. So she's hoping for that. But the problem is a lot of guys do strike back. And when they strike back, obviously this is where big damage is done. They do the big damage, right? They're bigger, etc. And they do the big damage. But doesn't that come as a surprise to a lot of people that it's actually males who are more likely to be struck than females? Is there anyone for whom that did come as a surprise? Is anyone going to admit it? You're not admitting it. I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people. Okay, so that's an example of where we got to even rethink what we mean by violence. But for this, let's look at what are the real causes of violence. And masculinity or gender stereotypes or masculine norms, toxic gender norms, all of those are actually not causal. There's no way to prove they're causal. Everyone's been trying for decades. And you can't prove they're causal. What you can prove is a correlation. And I'll give you a hint about, I did this over 5 years. I was asked to track all the profiles of the school shooters between like 1998 and 2003. And I was specifically asked to figure out why they became violent, right? And it's not a question I solved. A lot of us were spending a lot of time on it and still do. But one of the things we discovered was most of these guys were not highly masculine. They were the opposite. So I'm just getting that optic in your mind because I think you probably you'll go, oh yeah, that makes sense. What they would do is they would dress goth, or they would dress something off of a video game to go do what they did. But when you studied the guys, they actually weren't very masculine. They were putting that on in order to get themselves inspired to go kill people. Why did they want to kill people? They did not want to kill people because they were masculine. They wanted to kill people for a combination of these three. This is what really triggers violence. And violence is a disease. There are genes for it, and they get triggered. Right? It's a disease, and it's been a disease for almost 30 years, according to the AMA. So one cause is, and it's a completely unknown cause, hardly anyone knows about it, is environmental neurotoxins. They're hitting genes. And if you've wondered why there are so many more brain disorders in the last 20 to 25 years among kids, among adults, a primary reason is these. They're in the food, they're everywhere. It's a whole other topic. Trauma. This one is more commonly known. Obviously, if you've been beaten, if you're abused, and if you have any genetics at all that might send you as a male toward depression, what can happen is you will become depressed. And almost all male violence happens on the depression spectrum. So violent males are males who are generally depressed. We don't realize they're depressed, or we kind of knew it, but we didn't realize they would become violent. And of course, one of the things that can trigger that is any of these kinds of abuse or trauma. There's even some research that poverty itself can be a trauma that can trigger, because you got to get the genes triggered, right? So that can trigger them. And then the other one that's proven is under-attachment, especially to fathers. Under-attachment obviously can occur with mom. If mom dies or is mentally ill or is not around during early attachment, which is kind of a real mother-son time, about 90% of early attachment, primary attachment, is with moms. So if she isn't there, that can cause all sorts of issues, and also lack of father. So lack of attachment to father, primary determinant of violent behavior. The more father you get, the less violent you become. The less father you get, the more likely you are to become violent. Doesn't mean everyone raised without a father will be violent, right? These are statistical probabilities. So it once again mitigates this concept that it's masculinity or maleness or whatever you want to call it that is creating all this. In fact, the more male influence the kid gets, the less violent he's going to tend to be. So that's another myth we're going to have to deal with, and we got to look at the real causes, or we're simply not going to. Okay, I'm going to do the last one. I got a question. So I think I'm going to end with a funny one, and then take questions. So this shows you a difference in the brain. The father throws the child up. Child's only about this far up. The father's thinking, I want to throw that child up higher. The child is thinking, it's kind of high, but okay, let's try it. And the mother is thinking, that is way too high. And any of you have raised kids, you have lived this. And it's great. What's really great about it is it shows you how wonderful it is to be bi-strategic, how wonderful it is to give kids all sorts of options of the way that they're raised, rather than trying to find one single way. And that's why I show that. Okay, some questions. You covered a lot, right? And I actually had some policies. So I'll leave them up there in terms of policies. Hit me with some questions, though. Who's got a question? Or an argument. I love an argument. Go ahead.
The violence one where you talk about men hitting women or women hitting men. Just curious on that one, because if you look at like me as well, I feel like take just like the cheating boyfriend situation. People will applaud it if like the girlfriend slaps the boyfriend, but it's unheard of, or not unheard of, but it's frowned upon for the men to, strike the woman in that, she's cheating. Now I don't advocate hitting anyone.
Right, I understand your question though.
But
yep.
How do you change that mindset? Because I think for most people in this room, it's okay. I feel like a lot more people feel like that slap from a woman is okay versus the slap from the guy who does it back.
Right. And could everyone hear him? You couldn't hear. I'll repeat. He said when a woman slaps a man, like if you look at the media or probably just our cultural expectations, if the woman slaps a man or a girl slaps a boy, it's more acceptable in our culture than if the boy hits or the man hits the girl or woman. And I think we could all agree with that, that is sort of, you see that in the media, you see it everywhere. Yeah, the problem with it is that shows you how entrenched everything is. And, between where does change occur? The solution is it has to start in universities, because that's where all the movements started to protect vulnerable populations. They started in universities. And universities have to, all of you, have to be the academic force that says, we're going to look at all these myths and we're going to figure out what's really going on, and we're going to be the people who go out there and create public policy, like some of these policies, that where we're going to make changes so that ultimately we're going to have less of the hitting anyway, because what we really don't want either. And what I said to my daughters, actually, I was a very realistic parent, and I said to my daughters, I just want to tell you, you're seeing that on these shows. If you slap a guy, expect him to hit you back. So hopefully that will incentivize you to not slap a guy. And as far as I know, neither of my daughters have slapped anyone, because I just drilled that into their minds, because human aggression and human nature is powerful. And hey, if someone hits me, I'm likely to hit them back, if I have any empowerment at all. And of course, we don't want that in relationships. We want none of that stuff. But we're going to have to get through all of the layers of mythology. Okay, someone it was back here. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around kind of like the previous question and that whole thing. So basically you're saying, like in terms of the domestic violence, like women hit men more often,
but men do more damage.
Yeah.
Right, that's true.
Isn't that basically like the same deal with like, if I remember correctly, suicide rates where girls try it more often, but guys succeed at it more often? Like pretty much
Yes.
an extension of that type of
Yes,
idea?
he said, and it matches with suicide rates where women may try it more often, but guys succeed more, which they do, about a 4-to-1 rate. Males commit suicide to females, but females try suicide. What they do is gestures where they'll self-cut or they'll take pills, and then they'll call someone, because what they're trying to get is help. For the guy, it's more final. Guys will just do it. And of course, remember, we just don't have as much hitting the frontal lobe. So in terms of impulse, guys are less likely to override an impulse with executive decision making. Oh, you had more, go
And
ahead.
then, just a thing, you talked about optics a few times. What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean what you see in the media, what you see, those would be optics. Like what you see is a bunch of white men running everything. That makes it easy for everyone to just say, well, white male privilege is the problem, right? Whereas I'm saying, let's drill down. So we do have to, especially in academics, get beyond the optics.
So like a perception, right?
A perception. Great word, yeah, thank you. Go ahead. I think you were next. I don't know. Go ahead.
So seeing how classroom environments are always going to be like a lecture, teacher talking type of thing, how can there be changes to schooling to help males?
Yeah, they don't always have to be. What he said is, seeing as schools are always going to be lecture, how do we make changes that help males? Well, if you go on GurionInstitute.com, what you're going to see is a number of schools that no longer teach that way. And their test scores all go up, their grades go up, their discipline referrals go down. So it does not have to always be that way. But I understand your question. All these changes have to be made that are both theoretical, so in terms of educational theory and pedagogy, and then strategic, the strategies that teachers use. But the only real change that has to happen, and we have proven this in the last 20 years, is teachers just need to be trained. Once teachers get fully trained, it takes about a 1-semester course if it's at a university in male-female brain difference and boys and girls learn differently, or it's a kind of a year program in the schools. Once that happens, they organically switch the classrooms. They have guys moving around when they're taking tests, or when they're writing, to get the cerebellum involved and make sure the brain doesn't go to a rest state. All these theoretical and strategic things happen. So they can happen. And they do happen, by the way, in workplaces. If you go into workplaces, you notice the cutting edge workplaces, people are moving around, right? It's not just sit still. Okay, I have to do
Michael, one more.
one more, and I want to see if there's a woman who would like to ask a question. Okay, go ahead.
So on that note of the teaching, do you think that there's a way to teach everyone inclusively, like we need to be more interactive, it's going to be received in a good way for men and women? Or do you think that we need to cater 50% of it to be more active for our men and then kind of keep 50% of it how we've been because it's working for women?
Good. Okay, great question. I'll repeat. The question was, okay, in order to, for instance, change the way we teach, in order to help males succeed more, do we need, while also having females succeed, do we need 50% teaching toward guy brain and 50% teaching toward girl brain? Did I summarize okay?
Yeah, or
it's
like
not as
100%
nuanced, but
teaching one way for
or
everyone.
right, or 100% pick one way of teaching and find it, and the one that'll work for both. And that one doesn't work. The one thing doesn't work. It doesn't exist. What has to happen is it got to be organic because the teachers are already really smart people. So we don't want to be imposing on them some expert top-down, here's how you teach, we've tested it, pay us $1 million, we'll sell it to you. Those don't work. And they haven't worked for decades. What has to happen is training. The teachers who are already really smart get trained and retrained. And then they get a list of, like our Gurian Institute, we give out 100 strategies, you know, that were all tested in our University of Missouri pilot. But they also are developing them on their own. And when we come back to them a month or two later, they have developed 7 new strategies, you know, that they share. So they organically will do it, and they'll end up being able to bring the best of both, male and female. And that absolutely works, and we've got all the data to support that. So thank you, and I think we have to end.
Unfortunately,
Go
our
ahead.
time is up. Let me thank you for coming out.